The sky was colored scarlet, people were fleeing in panic, and buildings were collapsing. A huge monster towered over the metropolis, its body was pink in color and its face resembled a skull with bandaged eyes. It growled menacingly at the citizens of the city. The townspeople tried to escape from him, but some people stood in a stupor, they froze in terror. Yi Tian looked doomedly at the pink monster, his gaze was blank and dulled. His black hair fell over his face, he was wearing black pants and a white shirt. He looked more and more frightened with each passing second, but then a yellow lightning bolt appeared on his right cheek and began to spread from his neck to his fingertips. He stared at these metamorphoses incomprehensibly. Suddenly, his gaze filled with terror, Yi Tian's pupils narrowed. Already his entire body was covered with small thin lightning bolts. Yi Tian started to fall somewhere, thin red lasers appeared around him. He desperately screamed, his scream was piercing and deafening. Suddenly, his body froze in midair and was lit up by a thunder that resembled ball lightning. In the sky, surrounded by lightning, a bright pink sphere of energy appeared, which gradually descended to the head of the guy who was lying unconscious. It began to slowly enter Yi Tian's head. He woke up abruptly in his room on his bed. Everything that had happened earlier had been a vision of him. He was lying on the bed wearing a gray t-shirt and pants, and he was holding a rock in his left hand. Next to the bed was a desk with a computer and a notebook of stationery on it. He thought that he seemed to have awakened to talent, and what he had just seen was the remnants of a dream. He sat down on the bed and looked around his room. He sat closer to the window and began to look out at the gray and dim buildings of the apartment buildings. The sky was a soft blue color, cumulus clouds towered over the city. Yi Tian began to think about what was happening in the world right now. 100 years ago, countless spatial portals had opened up on the Earth. Ferocious monsters had invaded the planet, threatening the survival of the human species. He recalled the terrifying faces of the monsters, resembling demons from hell. Some looked like a dragon, others looked like a snake, a minotaur, a dinosaur. They all came out of dark portals and roared menacingly. The city was in shambles and burning. However, the spatial energy also contributed to people's talents. Some people, after awakening them, guided humanity into the era of talents. The people of the city fled in panic, looking back at the destruction and fires, while at this time, some people rose into the air, their aura appearing red. Each of these people also encountered a pink sphere of energy that entered their body. There was someone knocking on Yi Tian's door. It was his sister Yi Yu, who was asking if her brother had succeeded in awakening the talent. Yi Tian at this time sat on the bed and continued to look around his bright room. He thoughtfully looked with his red eyes at the black stone he had in his left hand. 3 yellow glowing circles appeared within it, and then a system window appeared out of the lightning, low-level talent. He covered his eyes frustratedly and exhaled loudly. He stood up, throwing the stone on the floor. Yi Tian thought about how the low level of his talent was annoying. He asked himself, will he really be nothing for the rest of his life, and if Yi Tian doesn't become a warrior, how will he protect his little sister? He walked to the wide window. It was stretched along the entire length of the wall. His little sister Yi Yu entered the room and mischievously called out to her brother. She was wearing a gray patterned t-shirt and a yellow short skirt. She had a black choker around her neck and wore a bracelet on her right hand. She had black long hair tied neatly into 2 high ponytails. Yi Yu asked with interest how Yi Tian was doing. The girl moved a little closer and asked what her brother's score was. Yi Tian continued to stand with his back to her, looking out the window. He smiled slyly and said he of course had a perfect score. Yi Tian lied to her so as not to upset her. His sister's eyes sparkled with joy. She put her palms together and asked if he really had such a good result. Yi Tian continued to smile slyly, but his eyes showed fatigue and dissatisfaction. He told her not to worry, for he would definitely become the strongest warrior. The younger sister jumped up, raising one fist aloft. It was as if she was glowing with happiness. The girl exclaimed joyfully and said she had the best big brother. She bounced vigorously, calling Yi Tian with her. The younger sister said she had prepared Yi Tian's favorite dish. After all, we should celebrate the awakening of talent. Yi Tian only quietly and uncertainly said he would come. As Yi Yu left the room, Yi Tian stood there and looked after her. He opened his eyes wide, looking at the system window in surprise. Person, Yi Yu. Enhancement talent, low level. Freezing talent, low level, not awakened. Yi Yu realized that her big brother was still standing outside her room. She grudgingly put her hands on her hips and asked what he was waiting for and called him with her again. Yi Tian was stunned as he looked at the system window. A drop of sweat ran down his face. He reached for the system window, but it suddenly disappeared and a new system window appeared. Human, Yi Tian. Enhancement talent, low level. He stared at it incomprehensibly, his gaze blank. He had to interrupt, for his sister grabbed his hand and called him to come along again, for the food would soon get cold. Yi Tian grudgingly and surprisedly exclaimed while Yi Yu happily pulled his hand towards the kitchen. When Yi Yu grabbed Yi Tian's hand, he felt a strange energy emanating from the point of contact. Yi Tian incomprehensibly looked at the new system window, Person, EU. Enhancement talent, low level, can be copied. Freezing talent, low level, can be copied. Etienne stood in a stupor and wondered how it was possible to copy other people's talents at all. The system window asked if Etienne wished to copy talents and provided a choice of 2 answers, yes or no. Etienne emotionlessly looked at his palm and thought that since he could copy other people's talents, then things were not so hopeless. Etienne and EU came to the kitchen made in gray and calm colors. His sister said she made his favorite pork stew. Etienne awkwardly rubbed the back of his head and thanked EU. There were 3 plates on the table with the main course, side dish and appetizer. All the dishes were still hot. They looked appetizing. They sat down at a chair and started eating. EU carefully told Etienne to eat more. He, with his mouth full, agreed with her. He thought about the fact that copying talents is an astounding ability, but he can't try it out on his sister. He had to give it up. Her main talent is better than his talent. After all, freezing is extremely rare. When EU awakens her, enemies will have a hard time. Etienne pictured in his mind an ice sorceress who was clad in blue armor with golden shoulder pads surrounded by ice. Their parents were dead, with portraits of mom and dad standing on a shelf. While Etienne ate the pork and rice, he mentally addressed their parents and said if they were watching them, they could be calm. Their mom looked happy in the photo. She had brown hair tied in a bun in the back. Their father in the photo looked happy too. He had short black hair. Etienne walked out into the city. There were skyscrapers and other buildings all around him. There were stores and karaoke places nearby. Etienne walked out onto a crowded street. People were going about their business on the wide sidewalk, not paying attention to Etienne. There was an underpass and various restaurants nearby. Etienne was wearing a black hoodie. He put a hood on his head. He decided to put his talent to the test. A purple radar began to emanate from his eyes in search of the person with the talent he was going to copy. The radar began to travel through the neighborhood, illuminating everything for Etienne with a neon purple light. The guy found out that the effective search radius was about 3 meters. He felt that it wasn't enough. He started looking at people's talents and their levels. Everyone who was near Etienne had talents of low levels. He angrily hid his hands in the pockets of his sweatshirt and thought that these talents were good for nothing. He needed at least a mid-level talent. Now, having awakened a talent, albeit a low-level talent, he could go look around the academy, but copying someone else's talent might cause his own to change. Therefore, applying to an academy where they are tested is not worth it. He walked along the sidewalk next to the department store toward the bus stop, his head down thoughtfully. He had an idea, raised his head enthusiastically and smiled. He walked up to Lehigh Bay's 5th Academy. A huge white stone fort appeared in front of him. The wooden gate was closed. On the stone near the entrance was the name of the academy, and there were muscular warriors wearing armor and helmets, many of them holding weapons and shields. Etienne furtively glanced at a warrior with a bare chest and large shoulder pads that glistened in the sun. Etienne thought that there must be quite a few people here with average talents. However, with his talent, he would surely become the strongest. He smugly looked at the building and the warriors of the academy, scratching his cheek. Lehigh Bay's 5th Academy, 10 days later, training ground number 5. The academy grounds were huge. The students were surrounded by a majestic fortress, inside of which was a small garden with trees and bushes, and in the middle was an amphitheater. There sat a teacher who said if they wanted to become warriors, they had to become students first. And to become disciples, they first had to undergo physical training. The teacher was a middle-aged man with a shaved head. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and black sweatpants. The teacher sat in the lotus posture and shouted that they would now practice with him. He said the exercise could only be considered successfully completed if they were able to concentrate the energy vortex at chest level. Etienne was sitting in the lotus posture. He was dressed in his academy uniform, white shirt, black tie and a long robe of purple color on the outside and red on the inside. Next to him sat a stocky guy with wide bushy eyebrows and short black hair. His name was Zhang Bao. Etienne continued to sit and exercise. When next to him the other guys started to fall down and breathe heavily, their bodies collapsed. Zhang Bao shouted to the teacher that someone had fainted. The teacher walked past them and said they shouldn't pay attention to these lowlifes because they only have a chance to become warriors if they can concentrate their energy. Etienne was breathing heavily, holding on from the last while beside him, the other disciple candidate stood on all fours and tried to catch his breath. Etienne was sweating due to the exertion and didn't understand why there was no way he could concentrate his energy. He thought that it might be because of his low level of refinement talent. The teacher unhappily stood in front of them with his arms crossed over his chest. He shouted that that was enough for today and said they were indeed the worst students he had trained. The teacher looked at them with dislike and told them to take Chen Dong as an example, strive to be better and not be so pathetic. Etienne angrily looked at him spitefully, sweat dripping down his face. Etienne and Zhang Bao were walking along the academy alley near the fountain. Etienne asked his friend who Chen Dong was. Zhang Bao said this guy is not easy. After all, he became a disciple in half a month, and now he is personally trained by the head of the academy. Etian thoughtfully replied to him that in that case, Chen Dong's talent is clearly not low level. Jiang Bao with a satisfied expression took out some leaf from his pocket, which had an autograph on it. On the sheet was Chen Dong's handwriting. Jiang Bao looked at the autograph haughtily and said he would wait until Chen Dong equaled the strength of the head of the academy and sell it. He wondered how many months he would have enough proceeds from the sale for. Etian smiled awkwardly, not knowing what to even say to him in response. As they passed by the fountain, they saw people starting to crowd in. They started saying that Chen Dong had come here, the crowd shouting out his name. Chen Dong looked like a young guy with blonde hair slicked back. He waved and said hello to everyone. Girls started walking up to him and one by one started asking for autographs. Jiang Bao abruptly snapped out of his seat, leaving Etian behind in incomprehension, and shouted Chen Dong, asking Chen Dong to sign for him again. Etian saw Chen Dong, the guy's eyes lit up and a sly smile appeared on his face. The girl with shoulder-length hair smiled happily and told Chen Dong that she admired him. Chen Dong smiled at her and waved and then thanked them all for their support. Etian saw a system window above the guy's head. Person, Chen Dong. Talent for improvement, medium level. Etian walked towards him with a smug expression on his face. He thought that he should also go over and say hello. After all, he wanted to try and copy his talent. Chen Dong smiled widely, lowered one eyebrow down and asked the crowd to calm down. He kindly told the crowd that he had come today to cheer them up instead of the teachers. He added that they should forget about autographs, because if anyone found out about it, they would become a laughingstock to the rest of the crowd. Jiang Bao ran behind the crowd, trying to get close to Chen Dong. Etian was walking behind him. He waved at Chen Dong and asked him in a friendly manner if he could shake his hand. Jiang Bao supported him, cheerfully saying that a handshake would be fine too. The girl next to them with red hair looked admiringly at Chen Dong, while the crowd was still asking him for autographs. The first in line to shake hands was Jiang Bao. Chen Dong shook his hand and encouraged Jiang Bao, saying that he would do well. Jiang Bao himself quite agreed with him. There were two people behind Jiang Bao, and after them, Etian was next in line, and behind him was a skinny girl with dark hair. Chen Dong shook hands with two disciples. One was a skinny guy with long hair and dark circles around his eyes, and the other disciple had waist-length hair. Both of them were wished good luck by Chen Dong, for which they thanked him. Chen Dong extended his hand and addressed Etian, calling him a friend. He said it was his turn. Etian gloomily looked at the outstretched hand. A sly smile appeared on his face and his eyes looked at Chen Dong's palm slyly. Etian extended his hand in return, and the moment he shook his hand, he once again saw the pink aura and felt the energy. Chen Dong wished him good luck, and Etian thanked him for it. Chen Dong, smiling and waving goodbye, walked in the other direction, away from the crowd. The disciples waved back, saying goodbye to Chen Dong. Jiang Bao also waved to him, and Etian beside him stood gloomily with him. Etian looked after Chen Dong faintly. He had a faint smile on his face. He had managed to copy the talent of the academy's top disciple. Quite quickly, it started to rain, which turned into a downpour. Dark clouds covered the sky. Etian was alone in the forest, with a small river flowing nearby. The guy crawled into a small hole nearby to hide from the rain. A system window appeared, successfully copied a mid-level enhancement talent. Start. There were two answers to choose from, yes or no. Etian looked at the system window thoughtfully and said he didn't know what the result would be after the fusion. The burrow inside was stone and quite wide. Etian scratched his chin thoughtfully and remembered the vision he had the night before the talent awakening, where he screamed in agony, covered in lightning. Etian wondered what that vision meant. His face was sullen. He decided it was worth it and started on the consent button on the system window. Then the merge began. He sat down in the lotus pose and began to concentrate. Energy began to flow from the bottom to the top, lifting Etian's hair into the air. Green particles hovered in the air. Suddenly, his chest area stabbed sharply. A vein began to appear on his face. He hissed in pain, and then the veins appeared on both his arms and chest. They began to show through his clothes. Etian clutched his chest and screamed in agony. Veins began to appear on his neck. He fell on all fours and started pounding his fist on the floor, wondering why things were happening like this. Etian began scraping the stony floor with his fingernails. He painfully crouched down and clenched his teeth. His eyes glittered madly. Etian said absorbing the talent was going to be hellishly painful. Outside, the downpour continued. Deafening thunder was heard, and a few seconds later, a dazzling lightning flashed in the sky. Etian tried to sit up straight, but it was hard for him to do so. He was breathing heavily, trying to regain his breath and strength. A system window appeared in front of him, informing him that his refinement talent was now at a medium level. Sweat ran down Etian's face. He smirked contentedly and said he had copied the talent. His refinement level had increased and added that this pain was worth it. While he was resting, a new system window appeared in front of him. The recharge time of the copying talent is 30 days. He was surprised, because he thought it was a one-time ability, but after a month, he could continue copying talents again. This ability was truly terrifying. His gaze became blank and unfocused for a second, his eyes wide open. He sat in the lotus posture again and decided to do the exercise the teacher had shown them. He interlocked his index finger and thumb and placed his hand on his knee. An energy vortex began to form, increasing in size. It concentrated around Etienne's chest, fluttering his hair in the wind. Etienne shockedly looked at the energy vortex. He couldn't even believe that he had succeeded at first. He realized that with a mid-level talent, it was easy to perform this exercise. He continued to watch the vortex for a while, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Etienne stopped the exercise. He stood up and headed towards the exit of the hole. He thought about how being an ordinary warrior was not for him now. He wanted to become an elite warrior, but then he immediately decided that an elite warrior was too weak for him and he would become a great warrior. The downpour continued, thunder rumbled and purple lightning flashed. Etienne proudly walked out of the hole. A thick fog had formed nearby. As soon as he came out of there, his hair immediately got wet in the rain. However, he didn't care. Etienne smiled evilly, furrowing his brows. A month passed by. The full moon rose above the city and brightly illuminated the night city with its white light. Only thick clouds occasionally blocked it out. A mysterious silhouette flew among the clouds. In the light of the moon appeared a monster that looked like a wolf, but it had horns and huge claws and a lush mane like a lion. His name was Silver Moon Wolf. His huge maw was full of sharp fangs, and steam was coming out of his mouth. He looked fiercely at the town. At that time people were coming back from work. A man was walking with his daughter, holding her hand and chatting. She asked him what they were having for dinner. He was holding a lamp on a stick and affectionately asked her in return what she herself would like. His daughter said cheerfully that she wanted fish, her father agreeing with her contentedly. At this time Etienne walked past them. He was wearing a gray sweater and black pants. He was also holding a lantern in his hand since the street lights were not working. He thought about the fact that although he had become a disciple, he still had a long way to go to become a warrior. Chen Dong was practicing one-on-one with the head of the academy, and it was logical that his progress was faster than Etienne's progress. At this time, father and daughter kept talking about dinner. Dad said he would cook her some fish once they got home. Suddenly, his lamp fell onto the pavement with a clatter, and scarlet blood spatters appeared in the air. The ferocious beast attacked the man, clawing at his head with its sharp fangs. Etienne heard a rumbling sound and froze in place for a second in horror. He turned around and was horrified. The man's body was lying breathlessly on the ground, with a formidable silver moon wolf walking beside him, galloping and glaring at his little daughter. The girl screamed in terror. She tried to call out to her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. The wolf opened his mouth. Steam continued to come out of it. It glared angrily at the little girl, preventing her from approaching her father's body. Etienne anxiously looked at the monster, trying to figure out what to do next. The elderly couple stopped in a stupor. The grandfather screamed in horror, realizing that this was the very real monster. All the people nearby started running away, screaming that the monster had killed the man. The monster began to eat the dead man while his daughter looked on in fear and panic. Etienne continued to stand, holding the lamp in his hands. It was as if he couldn't move. He couldn't take a breath because of the terror that engulfed him. This was the first time he had ever seen a monster in his life. Splatters of the man's still warm blood covered the asphalt, blood flying in all directions as the monster tore the body apart. The wolf glared fiercely at the girl, her father's blood dripping from its mouth. The monster leaped out of the way, attacking the girl, but Etienne jumped up in time and grabbed the girl, who froze in a daze. He looked at the way the monster was moving and realized that it was too fast and he wouldn't be able to run far. He still tried to get as far away as he could, holding the girl in his arms as the ferocious monster chased after them. At this time, a warrior with a red cloak and a huge sword in his right hand flew towards them. He landed right between Etienne and the wolf, striking his sword on the road. The asphalt began to crumble from the shockwave, throwing the wolf aside. Shards of the road scattered to the sides. Though the wolf flew several meters away, it quickly grouped in midair and landed on its paws. The monster ducked down, opening its maw threateningly and snarling at the warrior. It was surrounded by a red aura resembling smoke. It eyed the warrior warily, ready to attack at any moment. The warrior looked formidable. He had a great physical shape. He was dressed in a blue tank top, and his legs were covered in silver armor. The warrior apologized for his delay. He had a shaved head, bushy eyebrows, and a scar on his left cheek. Etienne was holding the girl's hands. He asked the warrior who he was. The warrior lifted me up majestically and answered him that everyone called him Captain Galewolf. Galewolf turned to Etienne and confidently said to leave Silver Moon Wolf to him and asked him to protect the girl. Etienne accepted his order, placing his hand on the head of the girl who was holding onto his leg, crying bitterly. Galewolf frowned and heroically ran towards the wolf, holding his sword at the ready. He shouted at it to attack him. Silver Moon Wolf ran at him and then tried to hit Galewolf with a powerful paw, but he repelled the attack with his sword. Etienne watched the battle with interest. However, he covered the girl's eyes with his palm, telling her not to look. Gale Wolf struggled to restrain the wolf's paw with his sword, cursing at him. Silver Moon Wolf was strong. The warrior bounced back, raising his sword higher. He tried to strike the monster with his blade, but it dodged the attack with lightning speed. The wolf bounced several meters away from him, but Gale Wolf did not give up and tried to attack the ferocious monster time after time. The warrior said as expected, the Silver Moon Wolf was very fast. The monster was running from side to side, preventing itself from attacking. Gale Wolf grinned and said it was not alone. At this time, 3 more sturdy warriors flew from the rooftops of buildings, holding their swords at the ready. Silver Moon Wolf ran in circles, dodging Gale Wolf's attacks. The monster raised its muzzle up and roared as it looked at them. All 3 warriors swung their swords at where they thought the wolf was, but the wolf ran away in another direction. One of the warriors turned around and called out to Gale Wolf, calling him captain. Silver Moon Wolf at this time was running frantically at Gale Wolf. The captain said the warriors had arrived in time. He crouched down slightly, bringing his sword forward. The captain was ready to repel Silver Moon Wolf's strike at any moment. The monster had already run at the captain, preparing to gnaw him to death, and the rest of the warriors ran after the wolf to help Gale Wolf. They were as fast as the wind, the men holding their weapons at the ready. Suddenly there was blood in the air, flying around and hitting the pavement. Captain Gale Wolf and his aides pierced the wolf's body with their swords, preventing it from moving. The warriors began to pull their swords out of the wolf's body, one of them haughtily asking if Silver Moon Wolf was dead. The beast clenched its paw, exposing even more of its sharp claws. Captain Gale Wolf stared at it for a second, frowning his eyebrows. Silver Moon Wolf began to blush and growl menacingly, shaking the air. Saliva sprayed from his mouth. One of the warriors called out to the others to be careful, for the monster had entered a state of bloody outburst. It stood on 4 paws and raised its tail upwards, its power causing the asphalt to crumble beneath it, a red aura emanating from the wolf. The warriors were thrown into the sky by the shockwave. A column of dust began to rise from the destroyed road. One of the warriors hit his head and back on the metal fence beside the road. Etienne was still covering the girl's eyes. He asked how the captain was feeling. Gale Wolf landed on his feet, rolling a little on the road. He replied to Etienne that he was fine. Silver Moon Wolf picked up speed, running off in the other direction, which Etienne yelled out, warning everyone. The guy's face looked worried and anxious, his eyebrows were raised upwards and his mouth was ajar. The monster leaped powerfully, hitting the roof of a building, and then began jumping from house to house, getting further and further away from the warriors. Captain Gale Wolf frowned and smiled. He said there was no reason to worry, for Silver Moon Wolf would not run far away. In the white light of the full moon, the silhouette of a girl with a bow could be seen. At this time the wolf did not stop and ran straight towards the archer without noticing her. Behind him, he left a trail of his crimson-colored aura. The archer was wearing an elegant silver and gold armor, her long black hair waving in the wind. She had already prepared her bow, loaded an arrow and was aiming while holding the bowstring. After a second, she released the bowstring, releasing an arrow with a sharp, metal tip. The arrow flew faster than the wind. The girl deliberately shot ahead of the wind so that it would hit Silver Moon Wolf right in the air and he wouldn't be able to do anything about it. The tip of the arrow came close to the monster's head. He noticed it, but he had no way to avoid being hit. Its glowing eyes were wide open and its maw was open in a silent scream. The arrow pierced through it, making a hole in the monster's neck. The breathless body of Silver Moon Wolf fell with a clatter right in front of the captain and Etienne. Gale Wolf smiled widely and said Silver Moon Wolf was too weak to fight them. The archer and the rest of the warriors gathered around the body of the slain wolf. One of them praised the girl's marksmanship and shooting skills, to which she laughed good-naturedly and agreed. Etienne looked at the monster in surprise as a system window began to appear above it. Monster, Silver Moon Wolf. Blood talent, low level. Speed talent, basic level. Etienne couldn't believe that the monster also had its own talents that could be copied in the future. The little girl next to her shockedly looked at the monster, leaning her hand against her chest. Suddenly, the monster's paw started trembling and moving. Etienne noticed it and stunned. The warriors were chatting with each other at this time. The archer said fighting with speed monsters was such a hassle. Another warrior suggested that they all go out for a drink to celebrate. Silver Moon Wolf at this time stood on his paws, shaking, but he was still alive. Captain Gale Wolf noticed this as well and loudly ordered everyone to be careful. The warriors turned around worriedly and looked at him, not sure what was wrong. Gale Wolf shouted that Silver Moon Wolf was still alive and ordered everyone to spread out. The warriors began to surround the wolf, who finally woke up. He lifted his muzzle up and opened his maw wide, growling loudly. The warrior said the monsters were terribly tenacious and asked the captain what they should do now. Gale Wolf stood in front of them, signaling them to stop, and bravely said not to worry, for the monster was riddled with weakness and they could leave it to the captain. Captain Gale Wolf turned around and turned to Etienne, shouting loudly that it was not safe here. He should leave this place immediately with the girl. Etienne continued to stand beside the girl, so the captain asked if he heard him and ordered him to run away from here faster. Excitement gleamed in the boy's eyes. He smiled slyly and thought that this was a great opportunity to test his strength and perhaps copy the abilities. Etienne Lightning rushed out of his seat towards the Silver Moon Wolf. The captain was dumbfounded and didn't realize anything. He did not have time to take any action to stop Etienne. The guy ran towards the monster and was already preparing to attack it by swinging his fist. Lightning was coming from his fist and he struck the monster's head with it. A system window appeared. The monster's talent was successfully copied. Etienne retracted his fist, then somersaulted in the air, landing on the monster's thigh as if he wanted to ride it. The system windows about copying talent appeared again and again. Silver Moon Wolf tried to throw Etienne off of him, growling and lashing out, but Etienne was equal to him in strength, copying his talents. Sitting on top of the monster, the guy swung both of his fists and then started punching it on its back, damaging it time after time. Etienne punctured its back with his fists. Blood spurted out from there. Etienne's face looked insane. He faintly smiled while taking the wolf's life. Drops of blood splashed onto his face, and his fists were completely covered in it. Etienne started to swing again, but Captain Galewolf abruptly grabbed his arm and sternly ordered him to stop, for the monster was dead. Etienne, in a fit of rage, didn't even realize that the monster was already unconscious and not breathing. He stared angrily at the monster, his pupils narrowed. He removed his second fist from the monster's body. The monster's blood dripped off his knuckles. Etienne reflected on the fact that he was now confident that he had copied the talent. Captain Galewolf shouted loudly with his mouth wide open that he should clean up the place. He ordered the corpses of the girl's father and the wolf to be removed, then instructed the archer to take care of the girl. The two warriors approached the breathless body of Silver Moon Wolf. One warrior started to lift the corpse of the man, while the archer walked over to the little girl and held out her hand. Etienne stood next to Captain Galewolf. They all began to slowly finish their business on the spot and began to leave. The archer took the little girl in her arms and Captain Galewolf walked over to her, slinging his sword over one shoulder. He turned to Etienne and thanked him for his help, then said he would be very happy to see the boy and his squad when he became a warrior. Etienne was still covered from head to toe in blood. He enthusiastically replied to the captain that he understood him. Etienne's eyes seemed to glow with joy. Etienne walked to the entrance of the subway station. Next to it was a public restroom. He went to the sink and thought to wash the blood off his hands. After all, he didn't want to show himself to Yu like this. He turned on the water faucet and began to thoroughly wash the dried blood off his hands and then his face. He washed his face diligently for a few minutes before turning off the water and looking straight ahead. A dirty mirror with water and soap smears hung in front of him. He looked at himself and made sure there was no trace of blood on his face. His face looked very tired and exhausted. Etienne's eyes were slightly covered. He started to get ready to go home, passing by multi-story houses and buildings. Etienne came to his apartment. He pulled the handle of the door with the electronic lock. He walked into the hallway, closing the door behind him. The apartment had no lights on and was very quiet. Etienne walked towards the kitchen and living room, after which he saw a sweetly sleeping Yu on the sofa. She must have been very tired and couldn't wait for Etienne. Yu started to smile in her sleep and mumbled something to herself about her brother. Etienne smiled propitiatingly and exhaled. There were several plates on the kitchen table, 2 bowls of rice, pickled lotus root, pancakes, and meat with spicy sauce. Etienne went to get a plaid, after which he carried it to Yu. He, smiling, covered her with the plaid so that she wouldn't freeze in her sleep. At the same time, he thought about the fact that today was the first time he had seen a monster in person, and it was dozens, no, hundreds of times more terrifying than hearing stories about them. Yu grabbed the top of the blanket in her sleep and covered herself more tightly as she continued to smile. Etienne looked at her and thought about the fact that for the sake of his little sister's safety, he should become a warrior as soon as possible. He walked into his room holding a small twisted towel in his hands. He sat on the edge of the bed and wondered, could monsters' talents fuse with the human body like this? Etienne frowned and wrinkled his nose. A system window appeared in front of him. Monster, Silver Moon Wolf. Blood talent, low level. Speed talent, base level. He realized that it would probably hurt more than last time, maybe even be deadly. But he wanted to become stronger to protect the people he cared about. Etienne stared at the system window for a while and was in doubt, but the thought of his family members motivated him to still start the talent fusion, no matter what it cost him. He put the towel in his mouth and clenched it tighter with his teeth so the pain wouldn't feel as bad. A new system window appeared, speed talent. Copying has begun. Etienne's eyes widened with shock and his mouth opened slightly at first. In excruciating pain, he fell to the floor face down, placing his hands and feet. Along his body, veins swelled up again, showing through his skin. Etienne began to scrape the floor with his fingernails, leaving scratches on the wooden flooring. He was in a lot of pain. It felt like his bones were splintering one by one. He clenched the towel hard with his teeth to keep from screaming and curled up in unbearable agony. His right leg began to tremble, then unnaturally bent, breaking Etienne's bones. He fell on his stomach and bent his back. The guy screamed shrilly and the towel fell to the floor. Etienne struggled to turn around his leg and realized that it was broken. Blood was flowing from the open fracture site, leaving scarlet marks on the wooden floor. Etienne thought that the copying had failed. He couldn't blink while looking at the fracture. It was as if his entire body was numb. His heart was pounding loudly, and drops of cold sweat rolled down his face. Etienne started to lose consciousness. He thought that this was the end. His last thought before passing out was what would become of EU. Night passed. The sky was bright blue and the clouds slowly floated across the sky. Etienne's room was lit up with bright sunlight while the guy himself was lying on the floor. He woke up abruptly and jumped up, gulping air greedily. He raised his hand and looked at it. Etienne couldn't believe that he was still alive. He looked at his right leg that was broken last night. Not only had it fully recovered, but his entire body had become more flexible. Etienne adopted a fighting stance, after which he swung his leg. A red plume of aura like silver moon wolf was left behind after the kick. He continued practicing his strikes, saying that his body had become as light as a feather. Etienne looked at the system window that appeared in front of him in surprise. Human, Etienne. Refinement talent, medium level. Speed talent, basic level. He realized that the copying was successful. After a while, Etienne arrived at the forest that was next to Lehigh Base 5th Academy. The academy grounds looked huge from a bird's eye view, a huge number of buildings, several public gardens with fountains, sports fields, and an amphitheater. A scarlet plume passed through the air. Etienne ran lightning fast along the forest path, covering several kilometers with amazing speed. He jumped off the cliff in a burst, being in flight for a couple of seconds. The wind fluttered his black hair, and Etienne himself looked incredibly happy. He was enjoying his new talent. He raised his eyebrows and smiled radiantly. Etienne started falling down, trying to land in a small clearing in the forest. He landed on 2 feet with ease, shattering the ground beneath him. A small leaf was falling from a tree, flying from side to side due to the wind. Etienne noticed it, as if the leaf he was falling was in slow motion. The guy started running faster than the wind. The leaf continued to fall. There was still a distance of a few meters between them. Etienne put his hand up, catching the falling leaf before it made contact with the ground. He squeezed it in his palm, causing the leaf to tear. Etienne fairly said the agility of the silver moon wolf was impressive. The guy jumped onto a large rock in the field, after which he sat down in lotus posture and started practicing. An energy vortex began to form around his chest. Etienne's breathing was steady and his eyes were covered. During the exercise, he thought that he was comparable to a warrior in terms of speed at the moment, but his strength was woefully lacking. He wanted to find a way to improve faster. His training was interrupted by Zhang Bao, who called out to the guy and waved happily. Etienne happily greeted his friend who was coming closer to him. Zhang Bao said he was looking for Etienne all over the academy, and it turns out the guy is training here. Zhang Bao looked at Etienne in surprise and then walked closer to him and touched his chest. He said Etienne had become so strong and asked if he had already become a disciple. Etienne was a little embarrassed and answered him positively. Zhang Bao made a sly face and whispered and asked if Etienne knew how to become even stronger in a short time. Etienne smiled contentedly, covered his eyes and asked how. Zhang Bao smiled while furrowing his eyebrows and asked if Etienne had ever tasted the blood of a monster. The guy shook his head from side to side and answered negatively. Zhang Bao made a creepy expression and pointed his thumb at himself. He said he advanced faster than Etienne because he drank the monster's blood. Etienne rounded his eyes in surprise. He felt as if he had been electrocuted. He didn't know that monster blood had such an effect, and he began to think about how much silver moon wolf blood he had missed out on. He rolled his eyes tiredly and remembered how he had beaten the wolf with his fists and how much blood had drained out of its body. Zhang Bao noticed Etienne's disappointment. He raised his index finger and said there was one way to get the blood. Zhang Bao asked if his friend was interested in it. Etienne immediately perked up and smiled. He asked Zhang Bao to tell him everything. He told him that the management of Lehigh Academy had unofficially set up an area outside the city that was used for the examinations of the 5 academies. The main prize for passing was monster blood. Apparently, the exam was organized by a bald, swarthy-haired man, an elderly man in good physical shape, and a woman with red hair. The blood was poured into a goblet made of gold. The goblet was decorated with busts of angels and moldings. Etienne started to ask about the exam. He asked what level it was, to which Zhang Bao replied that it was quite low, for the beasts there had long been wiped out and only their subspecies, the monsters, remained. Etienne scratched his chin and gave a serious look. He said it sounded tempting and it was something to try for. Zhang Bao smiled and put his hand on his friend's shoulder. He said since they were talking about this topic, would Etienne like to join his team to extract blood together? Etienne leaned his palm against his face and started to think whether to join. He made a thoughtful expression on his face and said he doubted it. Jiang Bao tensed up and asked with a concerned expression why he was doubting. He added that he told Yi Tian about it since he considers him a good friend. Yi Tian smiled blissfully, covered his eyes and apologized, saying that he would join them next time. The guy started to leave after waving goodbye, but Jiang Bao pretended to cry and said he thought they were friends and Yi Tian was so heartless. Yi Tian didn't pay attention and walked further away, increasing the distance between them. Jiang Bao noticed this and ran after him, asking him to wait for him. He said even if Yi Tian did not join his team, they would still remain friends. Yi Tian had his own reasons for refusing. He walked with a slightly tense expression and thought that if he teamed up with someone, he would run into trouble in the future if he revealed his abilities. For him, acting alone was the only option. He believed that this way, he would definitely obtain the blood of a monster and become a warrior. A month passed. Yi Tian came to Lehigh Bay's 5th Academy to the principal's office. There was a formidable middle-aged man sitting at the desk. He was very muscular. His head was shaved. He put his hands together and said since Yi Tian didn't send an invitation for the exam, there was no need to come to register. He also asked who had blurted out the information about the test in the first place. Yi Tian unemotionally told him that he was already a student and had every right to sign up. The headmaster smiled indulgently and scratched his cheek. He stood up from the table and said he only wanted the disciples to live a little longer. He grabbed some leaf and threw it at Yi Tian's face, shouting that they apparently couldn't wait to die. The sheet hit the guy's face and fell to the floor. Yi Tian reached for it and looked at what was written on it. It was a document about a waiver agreement in case of death. Yi Tian couldn't believe his eyes and read the full title of the document out loud. The principal sat back in his chair while drinking tea and said if Yi Tian wanted to participate in the exam, he needed to sign this paper. While the principal was drinking tea from a small white mug, Yi Tian continued to look at the agreement. The principal sternly shouted to him that if Yi Tian is afraid of death, then let him leave here and don't waste the man's time. Yi Tian walked out of the office. At this time, the students were walking down the corridor on their own business. The guy smirked smugly and then put his signature on the paper, squeezing out a wry laugh. The principal in his office stood opposite the window with his hands in his pockets. He pondered aloud, scolding the students, for they seriously thought this would be a normal exam. The man smiled evilly and said, no matter how the teenagers regretted their decision later. The next day, Yi woke up and got out of bed. She sleepily rubbed her eyes and yawned. Yi put on her slippers and went to the kitchen, calling her brother Yi Tian. She still looked sleepy and told Yi Tian that it was time to wake up. She was wearing a brown t-shirt and pink short shorts. The girl looked at the dining table and saw several plates of food. She was very surprised that Yi Tian had prepared all this and she wondered what occasion he did it for. There was a note on the table. It said an event had started at the academy and Yi Tian would be back in 3 days. Yi was surprised and thought about what kind of event could last that long and whether her big brother would be alright. She worriedly looked at the note. Her eyes became sad. At this time, Yi Tian was at the exam venue. It was an abandoned town with ruined houses and roads. The entire city was covered in dirt and dust. Trees had started to sprout on the roads, and outside of the exam time, only crows were flying here. An unpleasant wind was blowing, and most of the destroyed houses were blocked off with barbed rusty wire. A huge number of students from all over Lehigh Academy, from all the buildings, had gathered here. They could be distinguished by the colors of their school uniforms. Each building had a flag with their academy number on it. The students of the 5th Academy were chatting with each other, each carrying a bag of belongings and weapons. Yi Tian had a sand-colored backpack. Inside it was a bow with a set of arrows. He looked around the crowd of people who had come for the exam today in surprise and said quite a few students had gathered. Jiang Bao had a black backpack with green inserts. He was holding a large axe on his shoulder and laughing. He told Yi Tian that all 5 academies had participated in the exam. Someone smirked smugly and wryly asked how the worthless students of the 5th Academy were allowed to participate in the upcoming exam. The person speaking was a young guy wearing a red ceremonial uniform. His hair was long and he had a red dot on his forehead. In the scabbard, he held a large sword with a beautiful hilt decorated with precious stones. Standing next to the young man was a formidable man with a beard of blonde hair. He was stout and was dressed in a strict black suit. The man addressed the lad as a gentleman and said he could hunt both beasts and students during the exam. The man smirked maliciously and added that the fewer weaklings, the better. The boy wrinkled his nose and frowned. He said with a smile that he agreed with him, then added that the fewer weaklings, the more opportunities for the strong. Jiang Bao pointed at him from afar and told Yi Tian that his name was Xiaobei and he was the genius of the 1st Academy. Jiang Bao smiled and said in the Mo family, he was the strongest of the younger generation. Yi Tian looked at Xiaobei incredulously and said no wonder he has so much arrogance since he is from the Mo family. An unpleasant grinding sound was heard and the tip of the sword blade rolled on the pavement. It was held by a disciple in a purple tight tank top and shield gloves in his other hand. Someone ordered him to stop and asked who he was to bear his sword on the side of the First Academy. The stranger continued walking towards the students of the First Academy and then stopped. With a blue aura hovering around him, he belligerently stood up and shouted, addressing Xiaobei, ordering him to approach him. He threatened to kill him by stabbing him with his sword. Xiaobei grinned and smirked. He asked why the guy had come to him again, since he had beaten him up 10 times and if he was still bored. The stranger smiled at him, frowning his eyebrows, showing the seriousness of his intentions. A flock of crows flew over the ruins of the city, cawing loudly. Etienne stunnedly looked at the stranger with a sword in his hand and asked Zhang Bao who he was. Etienne's friend also tensed up. He said it was Yun Xing. He was a genius swordsman from the Second Academy, and in the past, he had been defeated by Xiaobei many times. The principal of the Fifth Academy spat irritably on the pavement and glanced at the students with a frown. There were many mimicry wrinkles on his face, which conveyed his displeasure even more vividly. He shouted at Yun Xing that he was an ignorant peasant and ordered him to stop all this, saying that he was detached from life. Etienne unhappily turned around at the principal and mentally told him that he was the only one detached from life here. Etienne started bouncing on the spot and waving his hands, encouraging Yun Xing. Yun Xing himself awkwardly turned around at Etienne's full joy and wondered who this guy was and why he was supporting him and not Xiaobei. Suddenly, beside Yun Xing and Xiaobei, a loudspeaker said fighting outside of the stifling zone was forbidden and violators would be disqualified. Yun Xing clucked and irritably said Xiaobei was lucky. The guy was really angry. He twirled his sword in the air and then roughly put it back into its scabbard. Yun Xing started to walk away, but lastly threateningly said once they were in the area, he would brutally massacre Xiaobei. Xiaobei himself looked at him mockingly, showing his disdain. He told Yun Xing that he would teach him a lesson in the battle zone. Yun Xing walked closer to Etienne and called out to him. The swordsman put his hands on his hips and said he was brave for daring to encourage him in front of Xiaobei. He asked what his name was. Etienne introduced himself and said he was from the Fifth Academy. His lips were pursed and his eyes expressed self-confidence. Yun Xing looked at him in surprise, his eyes were wide open. He put his hands on his chest and said it was a good name and made a pun from the meaning of his name. A dialogue box appeared, person, Yun Xing. Enhancement talent, low level. Talent for swordsmanship, medium level. Etienne carefully read his characterization and thought that his swordsmanship talent was at a pretty decent level. He extended his hand as a sign of respect, but actually wanted to copy his talent. Etienne smiled slyly and gave Yun Xing a sly look, telling him that he wished him good luck and hoped that he would surpass Xiaobei in the exam. Yun Xing was at first taken aback and didn't understand, but then he calmed down and smiled relaxedly. They shook hands. Yun Xing wished good luck in return, hoping Etienne would survive there. Etienne himself said he would be fine. During the contact, a system window appeared. The swordsmanship talent has been successfully copied. An order to start the exam was heard from the loudspeaker. 2 sturdy men began pushing the giant heavy gate, and once it was opened, the students of the First Academy were allowed to pass through. The crowd of students rushed towards the open doors in a flash, trying to arrive faster. Xiaobei rushed through the gate with the blonde-haired man who had been beside him the whole time. Xiaobei's face was gambling and self-confident. Zhang Bao excitedly looked at the open gate and was excited for the exam to start. He ran off in the other direction, saying that he went to his team, then said goodbye to Etienne. Etienne held onto the straps of his backpack and urged Zhang Bao to be careful. Yun Xing stretched tiredly and talked about how the First Academy was going first, then the Second Academy, and Etienne and the rest of the Fifth Academy would start last. He said he didn't envy them since they would only go at the very end. Yun Xing waved goodbye and wished good luck again, walking towards the gate. Etienne wished good luck in return, staying behind and looking after Yun Xing. He immediately changed his face, changing his benevolent expression to a cold one. He ran towards a forest full of thick trees with thick crowns. Various herbs and small bushes grew near the roots of the trees. Etienne rushed deeper into the forest using his talent for speed. He jumped onto one tree and galloped from one tree to another. Etienne quietly landed in the thicket of the forest. He looked around and thought that this place should suit him. The forest was quiet and empty. There was no one else here except for the guy. He threw his backpack on the ground along with his bow, arrows in his quiver and sword. A system window appeared in front of him. The mid-level swordsmanship talent had been successfully copied. Shall we start the fusion? He firmly pressed the consent button, for he must become stronger and pass the exam. The veins on his arms swelled. They gradually began to swell all over his body. Etienne was in pain, but it was no longer as painful as before. It looked like he was starting to get used to it. The crunching of bones was heard. Etienne clenched his teeth, his pupils narrowed. He fell on all fours and shrank back in pain. The veins on his face swelled up violently, and his teeth began to grind as he clenched them hard. From the forest, a pillar of white light rose into the sky. Yi Tian's face was covered in sweat. He abruptly opened his eyes. The guy picked up his sword from the ground and stood in a fighting stance. He pulled the sword out of its sheath and swung it sharply at the nearby trees. The tree trunks began to break neatly in half. One blow was enough to cut several trees through. Heavy trunks with branches and foliage began to fall to the ground, raising dust and dirt into the air. A system window appeared. Human, Yi Tian. Enhancement talent, medium level. Speed talent, basic level. Fencing talent, medium level. Yi Tian put his backpack on his back, put his bow and arrows in it, and attached his sword scabbard to his waist. From the loudspeaker, a notification was heard that the first 4 academies had entered the zone, and the 5th academy would be next. The students of the 5th academy proudly stood in a row and began to enter the gate. Crows circled over the ruined city, carping. The city looked like there had been a war here. All the roads were cracked and the roofs of the buildings had collapsed. Yi Tian walked along the central road. Weeds sprouted through the asphalt. He wandered aimlessly along the street, trying to find any monster. A few dozen meters behind Yi Tian, a green snake was crawling behind him, its scales glistening. Yi Tian heard the snake hiss and coldly drew his sword from its sheath. At this time, the snake increased in size, becoming several hundred times larger. It opened its mouth and threateningly hissed again. Yi Tian looked up at the giant snake. He quickly recoiled and turned to face it, flipping his sword. Yi Tian powerfully pushed off the ground and jumped straight towards the snake, holding his sword at the ready. The snake's eyes turned red, and it roared loudly at Yi Tian, sputtering saliva. Yi Tian swung hard, then struck the snake with his sharp sword, cutting it in half. Fountains of purple blood splashed around. Yi Tian remained cool and focused. He jumped away from the snake's torso, which fell heavily onto the road with a rumbling sound. Yi Tian walked up to the monster snake's head, squatted down and stuck his sword right into its eye. He pulled out an eyeball covered in purple blood and said the first point had already been earned. Yi Tian put the trophy into his backpack and said the monster was surprisingly weak. According to the rules of the exam, the more beasts they killed, the higher they went up in the rankings. Yi Tian wondered how many they had to kill them to pass the exam. A list of preliminary rewards appeared. First place, 100,000 yuan worth of medium-level monster blood. Second place, 100,000 yuan of medium-level monster blood. Third place, low-level monster blood of 5,000 yuan. Fourth to 10th place was entitled to a monster blood in the amount of 1. Yi Tian exhaled and tiredly closed his eyes. He realized that he had a long journey ahead of him. He put on his backpack with all his weapons and pushed himself off the ground. He quickly jumped to the other side in order to start hunting for bigger game. The wreckage of windowless buildings remained below. Someone called out for help among the high-rise buildings, shrilly screaming. Yi Tian was in the air and heard the cry for help. He looked down and then landed on the nearest rooftop. Zhang Bao was surrounded by a pack of ferocious wolves and his comrades were lying behind unconscious, pools of blood underneath them. Several wolves were dead, but Zhang Bao still had no chance of survival. He was telling the wolves to stay away from him while holding his axe. Yi Tian frightenedly looked at what was happening and realized that his friend was in danger. Zhang Bao's face was pale, it was completely in a cold sweat. His whole body was trembling and he couldn't hold his axe in his hands properly. In a trembling voice, he said it was too early for him to die. After all, he wasn't even married yet. The wolf with a scar on its eye growled threateningly while glaring at the guy, then jumped towards him. Zhang Bao screamed pitifully and tried to run away far away. Yi Tian realized that things were bad and needed to help him. He deftly took out an arrow from his quiver and loaded the bow with it. He stood gracefully on the roof, trying to take aim. The boy released the bowstring and the arrow flew out instantly. The wolf noticed the arrow flying, but he didn't have time to do anything, so the arrow hit him right in the stomach, piercing the wolf through. Blood flowed out of the wound, and the beast fell down heavily and stopped breathing. Zhang Bao didn't realize what had happened. He was still very much frightened. Yi Tian put the arrows and bow behind his back and jumped down from the roof towards Zhang Bao. Yi Tian coldly looked at him and asked if he would be willing to help him in exchange for points. Zhang Bao fearfully shouted out the guy's name, then ordered him to run away, for the fanged wolf he thought Yi Tian couldn't handle. A drop of sweat dripped down Zhang Bao's cheek and his eyebrows were frowned. Yi Tian covered himself with a red aura and used his speed talent. He ran past the wolves in a matter of seconds, leaving only a red aura plume behind him. He stopped and looked at the beasts, who growled menacingly and bared their fangs. The wolves all ran at him, but he began to pull his blade out of its sheath, covered in a blue aura. He used his talent for swordsmanship. With one swing of his sword, all the wolves were defeated and chopped in half. Yi Tian remained calm and cool-headed even in such moments. He was full of motivation and strength. His eyes were burning as he watched the bloody wolf carcasses fall to the ground with a thud. Zhang Bao rounded his eyes and froze in astonishment. He watched Yi Tian standing in the pools of wolves' blood while their corpses lay nearby. There was a blue aura around the guy. Yi Tian inserted the tip of his knife into the wolf's mouth and filed its fang, Then he pulled it out. Yi Tian leaned on his sword and put the fangs into his backpack. He said as agreed, she would take her points for killing wolves. Zhang Bao was not going to argue and fearfully said all the points belonged to Yi Tian. The guy closed his backpack and put it on. He asked Zhang Bao if he planned to continue fighting beasts. Zhang Bao tiredly plumped on the ground and said this was where he wanted to end. He became sad and said the exam was much more dangerous than he had originally imagined, and he was lucky that he was able to survive. His teammates were badly injured. We need to get them out of here as soon as possible. They all lay unconscious, all of them bleeding. There were weapons lying next to them. Zhang Bao hoped that they would be able to survive. Yi Tian exhaled heavily and calmly said Zhang Bao only had to help his comrades get out of here. He had already started to leave when suddenly Zhang Bao called out to him again and asked him to stop. Zhang Bao said with a serious expression that there were pseudo-monsters in the depths of the zone and asked Yi Tian to be careful. Yi Tian didn't understand what he was talking about, so he turned around in surprise and asked what kind of pseudo-monsters. The gradation was as follows. First came the beasts. They resembled ordinary animals in appearance but were more dangerous than them. After the beasts came the pseudo-monsters, which were already several times larger than the beasts and surpassed them in strength. The most dangerous among them was the monster that was bigger and stronger than all of them. Zhang Bao lowered his head and began to speak quietly. The students of the First Academy decided to attack a snake that was over 10 meters long. It was one of the pseudo-monsters. Zhang Bao looked up and said a little louder that there were 500 points for killing it. Yi Tian's face became mad and gambling. He once again asked about the number of points and then grinned, for he was ready to fight him. Yi Tian walked up to Zhang Bao and put his hands on his shoulders. The guy asked his friend where he could find this snake. Zhang Bao pointed his finger in the direction and said it was in the southeast. A gloomy and ominous aura hovered around them, with debris of buildings lying everywhere and discount advertisements reminding them that people used to live here. Yi Tian powerfully pushed off the ground and headed towards the southeast, leaving behind only dust and a trail of aura. Yi Tian was as motivated as possible to get 500 points. After all, it wasn't every day that one could earn so many points, and if Yi Tian got them, the first place would definitely belong to him. Zhang Bao had abrasions and scratches on his face. Lastly, he asked Yi Tian to take care of himself. The guy ran like lightning for several kilometers through the rubble, destroyed roads and abandoned buildings. He was gradually approaching the battle site of the pseudo-monster snake. Yi Tian ran faster than the wind, jumping over the obstacles in his way. But suddenly, he stopped abruptly and looked around. The bodies of the disciples of the First Academy were lying in front of him. He recognized them from their red uniforms. They didn't move or breathe, weapons and shields were scattered to the sides, and the bodies of many students were bleeding. Yi Tian was horrified for a second. Then he heard a loud noise. There was an explosion not far away, raising a pillar of fire and smoke into the air. Ashes immediately flew towards Yi Tian and he realized that there was a kite there, which would be given 500 points. He instantly rushed over there, leaving behind only a crimson-colored aura. Yi Tian jumped onto the dilapidated roof and began to observe what was happening. Everything around was on fire. More corpses of the students of the First Academy were lying among the debris. A giant silhouette could be seen in the distance. Yi Tian looked closer and realized that it was the pseudo-monster, although he didn't immediately believe his eyes. Amidst the smoke and fire, a monster could be seen whose lower part was a snake body and tail, while the upper part was more like a demon from the underworld. It had huge fangs and horns, sharp metal claws on its hands, and sinister red eyes. From its mouth, the serpent was releasing fire while at the same time, the red uniformed disciples were unsuccessfully trying to fight it. Below was Xiaobei, holding a sword in his hands, with his assistant. Xiaobei ordered everyone to join the fight. He shouted loudly. His face was serious. He was willing to do anything to defeat the beast. He said they should finish off this beast, and the points for it would belong to Xiaobei. The fighters, swordsmen and archers pounced on the pseudo-monster, using all their knowledge and talents. Xiaobei himself also jumped on the serpent, trying to pierce its tough scales with his sword. His assistant, falling down, shouted to him that the snake's stamina was running out and now was the time to kill it. The beast opened its mouth wide and screamed deafeningly, its eyes full of malice. It had another pair of sharp horns near its mouth. Xiaobei jumped on the serpent again, saying that he would take care of the rest. He turned his sword so that it would pierce through the beast. His sword was quite shabby, but that didn't make it worse. There was excitement in Xiaobei's eyes. He felt confident in his victory. Xiaobei jumped up to the head of the monster serpent, swinging powerfully in the air. The blade entered the skull of the pseudo-monster. Xiaobei was still experiencing mad excitement, savoring his victory. Blood spurted out of the pseudo-monster's head, and it roared in a burst of pain while Xiaobei was still on its head. Xiaobei could only think of the fact that he had won now. After a second, the monster threw him off his head, throwing him several meters forward. A few seconds later, Xiaobei landed in the debris of the buildings, a crack forming where he fell. He sat leaning on the wall behind him. Xiaobei smiled smugly. His entire face was scratched. He said 500 points would still be his. The heavy body of the serpent fell onto the road, blocking everyone's path. The fall even made the ground shake. There were rusted cars next to the body of the pseudo-monster, a pile of debris from the road and buildings around it, and the fire next to it continued to blaze. Watching everything on the rooftop, Etienne asked if he was dead, addressing the question to himself. He sat down on his knees and pounded the roof with his fist in anger. He thought that if he had come a little earlier, he would have been able to finish the monster himself. However, a second later, he was once again standing near the edge of the roof and looking down in surprise. Xiaobei threw the large boulder in his way out of the way and walked over to his classmates. His assistant bowed to him and asked him to accept his congratulations. The other students stood silently and did not react in any way. Xiaobei laughed smugly and smirked. He smiled widely and raised his fist in the air, shouting that the first place was now rightfully his. The blazing head of the pseudo-monster lay on the rubble and rocks. But after a second, he opened his eyes and roared again, showing everyone his huge fangs. It stood up and spread its giant tail a few meters, its body turned from red to purple, its eyes began to glow brightly scarlet. The beast stuck its tongue out at his hand and screamed deafeningly. A purple aura appeared around it. With its tail, it tossed several students aside. They didn't understand why the serpent was still alive. Their bodies flew into the rubble of the buildings. Xiaobei and his assistant stood at a distance while the bodies of their comrades fell beside them. Xiaobei realized that the serpent had gone into a state of bloody outburst. He frowned and clenched his teeth so that they began to grind. The serpent jumped into the sky and flew away, leaving everyone behind it. Xiaobei shouted to everyone and said it was not a pseudo-monster, but a full-fledged monster. His eyes bulged and his pupils narrowed. He was angry. The students of the first academy were dumbfounded and shocked that the serpent appeared to be a real monster. They asked if they should chase after it then. Xiaobei abruptly turned around and shouted to them that they should definitely chase after it, because killing it would not earn them 500 points, but 1,000 points. The disciples' mouths were wide open and their eyes rounded. They asked about the 100 points, and Xiaobei ordered them all to go forward, as they could not let anyone else get ahead of them. They all ran towards the direction where the monster was supposedly hiding. Xiaobei ran with all his might. He frowned and curled his lips. He was thinking that the previous attacks had greatly weakened the snake, so he needed to catch up with the monster as soon as possible before the others intercepted. Otherwise all their efforts would be in vain. Etienne stood on the edge of the roof and listened to their conversation. He began to be covered in a crimson aura and said he never thought that a monster worth 1,000 points would appear in the exam. In addition to the aura, glowing particles appeared beside him. Etienne smirked contentedly and furrowed his eyebrows. His pupils narrowed and his hair rose into the air because of the aura. He laughed and said he would be faster than the disciples of the first academy. He assumed a pose from which he could jump most comfortably and fastest, leaning on the toes of his hands. He activated the speed talent to maximum, crouching down slightly. The aura started to become more intense, illuminating everything around him with a crimson light. Etienne looked forward furtively and tore off the roof directly towards the giant monster, raising dust on the roof. He flew a few kilometers, getting closer to the monster. The serpent left a trail of pink slime behind it. It was crawling in a certain direction. Through the shards and debris, it got as close as possible to some building and decided to hide in it. At this time, Etienne had already traveled most of the way, flying past the rooftop buildings. He landed on 2 feet, putting his hand up for balance. All the dirt from the ground rose into the air. He looked around, seeing no one, and realized that the disciples of the first academy hadn't come here yet. That was a good thing. Etienne noticed huge paths of pink slime stretching meters ahead. He got down on one knee and took a closer look, examining the slime. He touched it with his finger and ran his finger over it, then sniffed it gently. He realized that the trail of slime skirted the entrance of an abandoned shopping mall, from where an ominous pink aura hovered. Etienne smirked contentedly as he looked at the building and thought about the fact that 100 points would go to him. There was a foul odor coming from the building. Etienne thought about how bad the snake's smell was. He started walking towards the entrance. Something cracked and broke under his feet. Etienne knew that this monster was somewhere nearby. He walked quite fast and carefully, looking around for the monster. Suddenly, he noticed the silhouette of a monster that had its mouth open and was drinking something white that was dripping from the stalactite on the ceiling. The closer Etienne got to it, the more the stench from the monster grew stronger. He saw that the monster was the size of an entire house. Inside the mall, broken glass, wooden bars, and window frames were lying around. The liquid on the stalactite glistened and kept dripping directly into the monster's mouth. Etienne wondered what it was drinking, for it was clearly not ordinary water. Particles of purple dust flew in the air, getting on the guy's hair and clothes. He frowned and stood there for a few seconds before pulling out a shining sword from its sheath with a clang. Etienne placed the sword in front of him and said he would find out what the monster was drinking after the massacre. He smugly smirked and grinned. Etienne crouched down for a jump and jumped upwards with a rumble. He flew a few meters while holding his sword at the ready. His face became calm and cold-blooded again. The beast turned around at the noise and stopped drinking the liquid, closing its mouth. He noticed the guy approaching him and put his hand up to repel the attack. Yi Tian noticed it a second before the collision and realized that the monster was very fast. The monster threw the guy aside with his arm, he dropped his sword and he started falling to the ground. While Yi Tian was falling and flipping in the air, he took out his bow, grabbed the hilt and fired several arrows, aiming carefully and carefully. All of the arrows split the air and hit the monster's eyes, blinding it and causing it to growl in pain. Blood flowed out of its eyes. Yi Tian landed and tossed his bow, arrows and quiver aside. Then he noticed his falling sword that was spinning in the air. Yi Tian waited a moment and firmly grasped the hilt of the sword. He jumped towards the monster again, approaching its arm and stabbed the sword into its hand, causing the monster to scream terrifyingly. Yi Tian inserted the sword deeper and began to swipe it all over the monster's arm. His hands were shaking as the monster's skin and muscles were dense. Veins appeared on his neck and face from the tension and he shouted in a burst of anger. Purple blood flowed in rivers down the monster's arm. Yi Tian pulled out his sword and jumped aside. The entire battlefield turned into a bloody mess. Yi Tian deftly landed on his feet and the monster fell down with a thunderous crash. It was definitely dead this time. Around the monster's body, dust rose into the air. Yi Tian exhaled happily and smiled. He said the monsters were very strong, and if Xiao Bei's group hadn't weakened it, there was no way Yi Tian would have been able to handle it. Yi Tian said this reasoning was of no use right now and picked up his backpack from the ground. He started to approach the mysterious liquid stalactite. He took out a beautifully decorated vessel with a wooden stopper from his bag and said since the monster was coming here just for this liquid, it was definitely a very valuable thing. He decided to collect some of the liquid and then think about what to do with it. Yi Tian placed the glass vessel under the stalactite and the liquid started to drip down there. Yi Tian sat on the monster's head and put his sword into the monster's eyes. He started to forge the eyeballs out of the monster's skull. He took out the first eyeball and said they would serve as his proof of murder. He then took out the second one and stacked them near his backpack. He was then able to open the monster's chest to take out its heart. The blood from the monster's heart was very valuable, so he decided to take it with him as well. He made a small incision, from where a thin stream of blood flowed out, which Yi Tian collected into another vessel. He walked over to the first vessel and looked at how full it was. He picked it up from the ground and said it would be enough. He had no idea what that stalactite hanging from the ceiling was, but he didn't want to leave Xiao Bei a drop from there. Yi Tian struck the end of the stalactite with his sword and it broke, falling to the ground with a clatter. Yi Tian started to load his catch into his backpack and thought that the points he had gained were more than enough for first place and it was time to get out of here. He was pleased with himself and smiled slyly. A short while after Yi Tian left, the monster in the mall was discovered by the students of the First Academy. They crowded around the body and started talking about how the eyeballs were missing, which meant that someone had taken them away. They also noticed the heart pulled out of the chest and realized that all the blood had been drained from there. The bearded assistant Xiao Bei worriedly turned around and shouted that only a corpse was left and all the valuable parts were missing. He asked what they should do in such a case. Xiao Bei clenched his fist so hard that veins appeared on it. The First Academy disciple's hand was shaking. He irritably asked who did this. Xiao Bei's face contorted in a grimace of anger and hatred. He shouted as loudly as he could. He wrinkled his nose and furrowed his brows. His pupils narrowed. He aggressively asked who dared to steal his 1,000 points and promised to destroy whoever did it.